Good morning, good morning. All right. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Shekalim Daf Yud. We left off learning the machlokes between Rabbi Yossi and the Chachamim, whether a individual carbon can be converted into a carbon tzibur. The Chachamim say that no, there's a fear that the person might not give it over for the tzibur. They will want for it to be used, but they would want for theirs to be used. And if it is a carbon tzibur belonging to a private individual, will invalidate it. And Rabbi Yossi, the Tanach Rabbi Yossi, has no such concern. Then the Gemara said that all of this machlokes is only by a carbon itself. But what the Gemara calls machshirei carbon, preliminaries to a carbon, and the first item we learned about was the wood that was donated, that could have been donated, what de facto was donated by individuals, that there, everyone will hold, says the Amoida Rabbi Yossi, that since it's not the carbon itself, the owner will fully give it over to the tzibur, and l'kula alma, the Beis Hamikdash, will be able to use it. We're going to elaborate other such examples where we see again, especially according to the Amoida Rabbi Yossi, that we differentiate between the carbon itself versus machshirei carbon. We will be learning and reviewing halachas that we learned in Masechta Menachos regarding from which region must the omer and the shtei halechem originate from. And as we will learn the shita of the Tanach Rebbe Yishmael, who holds that ein ha'omer ba misuria, certainly not from areas that are farther from Syria. At least Syria was a kibush yachid. Certainly not from Chutz La'aretz, that the omer must come only from Eretz Yisrael. We're going to see whether our Mishnah must follow Rabbi Yishmael, or as the Gemara will conclude, our Mishnah can go l'kula alma. Now, another topic that we had something similar not that long ago in Sachem. When money belongs to Hegdish and you deconsecrate the money, that only works if the kedusha of the money goes into another thing. So now the thing, the item becomes kadosh and the money becomes chulin. Question is, how did one pay the watchman of the Sfichei Shviz, as we learned in the Mishnah, with the money of Hegdish? How exactly did that kedusha go away from the money? So you pay for a service. A service is not a tangible thing. So there's nothing upon which for the kedusha to be exchanged on. So we're going to explain how indeed did they pay the watchman, with the watchman at the end being allowed to use the money because the money was not kadosh. And on Daf Yud Amud Beis, we will list, the Mishnah will list many additional items that were funded with the annual shkalim, the items that were funded with the shirayim from the annual shkalim. Then we're going to learn that there was a surplus to the shirayim, meaning from one year going into the other, what was the meiser of the shirayim of the shkalim used for, etc. We're going to through that learn, and the Gemara will even elaborate more regarding the money source for many other items that are tzarchei tzibur. And let's also remember that aside of the shkalim, and therefore the meiser shkalim and the shirayim and the meiser shirayim, you have donations that were given to the Berek Habayis. So exactly when certain things were needed in the Beis Hamikdash, what was the criterion? That comes from the general temple upkeep fund, from the Berek Habayis fund. The other thing that has to come from the Shekalim fund, we'll clarify that. And at the end of the Daf Yud Amud Beis, we will have a discussion. And according to the first approach of the Korban Ha'eda, according to many, the discussion will be whether a person, before the proper full building of the Beis Hamikdash, if a person, as long as the Mizbeach is on its exact location and the Mizbeach is built properly, whether people can offer karbanos. Now, the Gemara doesn't go into the details. There are many other issues that are not discussed over here. There are inyanim of Tuma, Bartame, so certain things, but Tzibur, there's a certain heter on Tuma. Then there is who is a Kohen. The Gemara doesn't touch about that. The Gemara wants to know whether the Mizbeach could be used if the Mizbeach is on its location. If, let's say, does the Mizbeach need for the menorah also to be in its right place, for the shulchan to be in its right place, v'chulei, a fascinating discussion, machlokes in the Gemara, and much more. Let us start on Daf Yud Amud Aleph. We got into 12 lines from the top of the Amid. as we just reviewed, the machlokes between the Chachamim and Rabbi Yossi, whether we allow for a individual, whether a yachid can, so to say, convert his or her carbon into a carbon sibur. And Rabbi Yossi says yes, the Chachamim say no, but the Amoida Rabbi Yossi said that when it comes to the wood donations, and we're calling this machshirei carbon, everyone is moida, everyone will agree, even the Chachamim, that even though it belonged to an individual, they fully give it over to the tzibur, and therefore the tzibur may use it. Continues the Gemara Tanach, and 12 lines from the top. Tanach, we learned in a brayso. If a woman, we're speaking here about the mother of the Kohen Gadol, if she made the tunic for her son, the Kohen Gadol, she made it out of her own pocket. And the question again is whether the Kohen Gadol, who has to wear garments that belong to the tzibur, whether she fully gave it over to the tzibur or not. Says the Brayse Ksheidam, as long as she knows, ubelvat tim serena letzibur. So here again, Amar Rabbi Achim. This Braisa can only follow our Rabbi Yossi, because it's only Rabbi Yossi that says that someone can volunteer to be the guardian for the Svichim, for the Omer, even though there's a chance that that person, to prevent others from taking the Svichim, will take first ownership of the barley and then give it over, and the giving it over is going to actually be a proper giving it over. That Afaroitzim is not of Shemer Chinam. But according to the Chachamim, who hold that you must pay the guardsman, because if a person were to own the Omer for a moment, then the person might not fully give it over. So then the mother of the Kohen Gadol similarly will not be allowed to make out of her own funds, out of her own pocket, the kesoinus or other garments for her son. And here again, the Amoida Rabbi Yossi says, in the name of Rabbi Elyahu, that no, that Braisa divrei hakol hi. Because Matilde, where do we have our machlokes? Only because of shel carbon. Right, the carbon itself, the barley itself, is that which is going on the altar. And indeed, the Chachamim hold that a person will not properly convert it to the tzibur. Carbon. Here, interestingly, here we are referring to the big day kahuna, to the kesoinus of the Kohen Gadol. He says, Kol alma moida aleph v'lo moida zayin. Shehu yes, shehu mishtana, that it will be properly converted from being a, so to say, a carbon yachid. It doesn't mean a carbon yachid. It means a machshirei carbon yachid le carbon sibur. Next says the Gemara. Mas Nisan, the following brayso, apparently pligi al Rabbi Yossi. The way Yerushalmi words it, that the brayso argues with Rabbi Yossi. Of course not. The Rabbi Yossi, the Amoira, cannot argue with Atana. That's the way we are wording the question. Why? What's the Brayse speaking about? Oisam hayamim noihagin b'shas karbon v'shaloi b'shas karbon. This Brayse is going back to what we began in the Gemara on top of the Amid, the sugi that we have in Tainus, that there were 9 families that when we built the second Beis HaMikdash, and when there was indeed a wood shortage, they donated their wood, and subsequently that date for each one of these 9 families became a Yom Tiv. Says the Braisa that those days, Noihagen meaning Yom Tiv. Yom Tiv means that they did not make Hespedim, they were not allowed to fast then. There was a certain refraint in doing work. Not only B'Shas Karbon, that means during the times of the second Beis HaMikdash, but even Ushalei B'Shas Karbon, even later. And Rabbi Yossi Omer, Ein Noihagen Elo B'Shas Karbon Bilvad. That's number one. Now, l'cha'ura, noyeg, to be noyeg a Yom Tiv, that should be connected because the family actually brought a carbon. So it's not mistaber, that's really the question, that a family will have in perpetuity a Yom Tiv because they donated machshirei carbon. The wood is a carbon itself. And if the wood is a carbon itself, then we will have to say that, as we quoted, that whole sugi and tainus is only going according to Rabbi Yossi, which is not the end of the world. It doesn't have to go l'kula alma. Another, so that's a kasha on Rabbi Yossi the Amoira. V'oid, another kasha. Menadod the Tanya. That Omar Rabbi Elazar Bey Rabbi Tzadok, Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Tzadok, says that when we'll learn tainus, we'll see that Sinaa ben Binyamin was the family that brought the wood on the 10th of Av, on the 10th of Menachem Av. That we were from that family. And one year, V'chal Tisha B'Av Liyas B'Shabbos, which is something that happens nowadays. And what happens if Tisha B'Av falls on Shabbos? So the fast itself becomes nitcha to Sunday, to the 10th of V'dochinu Oisei L'Matzei Shabbos. Now hold on. The 10th of Av for them was a Yom Tiv. So what did they do? So v'hayinu misanim v'loy mashlimim. So they made a compromise. They said, listen, we're not going to fully fast the 10th of Av because it's our personal family's Yom Tiv. On the other hand, it's Tisha B'Av. I know it's a nitcha, so they began to fast, but they didn't finish the entirety of the fast. Now, this would only happen if their Yom Tiv is indeed a chashuv Yom Tiv, all predicated on their wood donation being a carbon itself. If the wood is viewed as only machshirei carbon, can be that a family that was participating in machshirei carbon would find their Yom Tiv so powerful that it can overrule Tisha B'Av. Taka not Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av, it's Taka Tisha B'Av Nitcha, but still it's a Nitcha from the day of Tisha B'Av. So these two braises lead us to believe, and we'll learn a lot more about this in Kachim, that wood itself is viewed as a carbon. And if that is the case, then this whole sugya and tainus of every individual being allowed to donate wood, and those families were donated wood, and the Beis Hamikdash used their wood, even if the Beis Hamikdash had in stock wood, that's all based on the shita of Rabbi Yossi of our Mishnah, and it's not l'kula alma. Rabbi Yossi over here holds that a yachid who gives something over to the tzibur does so with a full heart, and it does fully become converted for the tzibur, but that's only shitas Rabbi Yossi. Weiter. Says the Gemara referring back to the Mishnah. Ho'emer, and shtei alechem, and lechem apanim, and v'chol karbanes hatzibur, right? All of this, says the Mishnah, came from the half a shekel fund, from the Truma. Says the Gemara, here we can read the parentheses, that our Mishnah can only follow Rabbi Yishmael, because it is uniquely Rabbi Yishmael that holds that ein ho'emer ba min hasuriya, and we'll see soon, and therefore what? And we'll see soon, the Gemara is going to fear ois, how, at least that's the Havamina, our Mishnah only follows the Shita. And now, without the parentheses, right, now we're getting used to the language. Taman Taninan, we learned over there, we are quoting a Mishnah in Menachos. Kol HaKarbanes, the Mishnah there is speaking about Menachos, all grain karbanes. If they are from a Yachid, or if they are from a Tzibur, the grain may come Bo'in Min Ha'aretz, and it may also come from Chutz La'aretz. It may come from the Chadash. Now, Chadash, no. Chadash means, guys, before the Omer, a person cannot eat from the new grains. But in the Beis HaMikdash, aside of the carbon Omer, until they brought the Shtei HaLechem, the Menachos in the Beis HaMikdash was not allowed to come from the Chadash. The Shtei HaLechem is the matter for Chadash in the Beis HaMikdash. So Chadash means after the Shtei HaLechem. But then they can bring from the new grains. And mind you, aside of two karbanis, all the karbanis in the Beis Hamikdash that were made out of grain came from wheat, seder. Umin hayashin, and it can also come from yashin. Chutz, however, chutz min ha'omer, and aside of the shtei alechem, she'ein bo'im ella min hachadash. Number one, it has to come only from that which grew this year, and number two, it has to come from grain that grew in the Holy Land. Umin ha'aretz. So says the Mishnah, and on that, says Rab Chuna, in the name of Rabbi Yirmiyah, that you should know that this Mishnah only follows the Shita of the Rabbi Yishmael, because it is Rabbi Yishmael that says, Ein ha'omer ba min Asuriya. Now, guys, we're going to come back to our Mishnah in a moment, but we're going to go through two other Mishnayos that we will clarify that it only follows Rabbi Yishmael. Next one, Taman Taninan, this is a Mishnah in Kalim. And again, this is only going to follow the Shita of Rabbi Yishmael. That Eser Kedusha is saying that there are 10 general levels of Kedusha in the world, in which one location is separated from, and then thus elevated from others. So beginning at Eretz Yisrael is holier than the rest of the world. Right, then we're going to, the Mishnah there speaks about how Yerushalayim is holier than Eretz Yisrael. And then we go in the Makim HaMikdash, there are all of these levels, and in total there are 10 Kedushas. And we're going to focus just on the first, that Eretz Yisrael, Mikodeshes Mikol Ha'aratzos. Now, how does that Kedusha find expression in Halacha? Umai Kedusha. So this is all part of the Mishnah. That Shemivian Mimeno Ha'emer V'Abikurim V'Shtei Alechem Ma She'ein Mevian Kein Mikol Ha'aratzos. End of Mishnah. Again, says the Gemara, either Rab Chia or again the same Rab Chuna. in the name of Rabbi Yirmiyah says that you should know that this Mishnah in Kalim only follows the Rabbi Shmuel, because it is only Rabbi Shmuel that says Ein ha'omer ba min Asuria. The other Tanoim, whether it's Adas Yachid, whether it's Rabbi Akiva, whether it's the Chachamim, they would hold, like we had in the beginning of the Mishnah that we quoted from Menachos, that all karbanos, grain karbanos, can come in ha'aretz, min chutz la'aretz, min ha'chadash, min ha'yashan. I know that the Omer Shtei Alechem has to for sure be bin ha'chadash, but they hold it can be from chutz la'aretz. Guys, Surya doesn't mean only Surya. Just again to clarify, and we'll speak about this in greater length, that when we conquered the Holy Land, it's called Kibush Yachid, and Kibush Surya was considered a private Kibush of David HaMelech. There's a big machlokes in Rishonim. Why was it a Kibush Yachid? Whether it is that most people did not, it wasn't with the consent of all. Was it that no consent of the Urim V'Tumim? Was it that we conquered Surya before Kibush Eretz Yisrael happened? But it doesn't only mean Surya, it means for sure not any other Chutz La'aretz. Don't forget that these locations did have many Dinei Derabanan. For example, Trumos or Maisros have to be separated in Surya Miderabanan. Nevertheless, Rabbi Shmuel holds you can't bring the grains for the Omer from there. And now we're going to learn the final third Mishnah. And this is a Mishnah in Shvias. Taman Tanene we learned in Shvias, Rabbi Shmuel Omer, Nachevra, this is a Gavaldik Pasuk in Chitas, in Parshas Mishpatim. Right, it says Sheishis Yamim Tavoid Ubayoyim Ashvi'i Tishbois. That's clearly a pasuk about Shabbos. The same pasuk continues Becharish Ubakotzer Tishbois. Rest from doing Charisha and from doing Tzira, from plowing and from reaping. Now, what is the seifa of the pasuk referring to? So Rabbi Akiva Rashi brings down. We're going to just focus on Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yishmael understands that this entire pasuk is still focusing on Shabbos. But why does the Torah specify these two malachas that may not be done on Shabbos? B'charash u'b'kotzer, the lamates malachas may not be done. And on that he explains, the Torah is being merames, we don't have anywhere in the Torah a mitzvah to plow. So charisha is always reshus. The Torah says don't plow. The Torah is being merames, what type of plowing may one not do on Shabbos? Only charisha, that's reshus. Which means, theoretically, if there would be a Charisha Shal Mitzvah, that does override the Shabbos. Now, there's no Charisha Shal Mitzvah, which is why the Pasuk in Mishpatim juxtaposes Becharish Ubekotzek Tishbois. When do we need to rest from reaping on Shabbos if the reaping is only a Reshus, like the Charisha? Now, which reaping is a mitzvah? There's one reaping that's a mitzvah, and that's the Ketzira of the Omer. Now, the Omer is brought on the 16th day of Nisan, and in order for the Omer to be the freshest as possible, it was reaped the night prior. Now, what happens if the 16th is on Shabbos? Knows what happens if Erev Pesach is on Friday. I'm sorry, if the first day of Pesach is on Friday. Whether this happens with the fixed calendar, I don't think so, but then, Shabbos is the 16th. The Omer is brought on Shabbos. Then you would reap those barleys Friday night, which is Shabbos. That's the limit. That macharish reshus, af kotzer reshus, and that comes to be merames that yotza, the isur of Shabbos, the need to rest excludes the need to rest for the ktsir ha'omer, which is a mitzvah. Now, how does that prove that the omer can only come from Eretz Yisrael? So says the Gemara like this: that this Rabbi Yishmael is l'shitasei, is kedate de Rabbi Yishmael. Since Rabbi Shmuel says Ein ha'omer ba min Asuria, connected, and therefore what? You have to have a little bit of a you have to chop over here. If the omer, you see, here's the challenge. We spoke about bekitzer in the mitzvah in the Mishnah. We're not allowed to plant on the Shemitah year. So how do you have omer? So we answered out because even there are many things that are called sfichim. Even when you don't plant, something grows. It must be that this is only the shita of the Yerushalmi b'shitas Rabbi Yishmael. That our Gemara holds that Rabbi Yishmael must hold that if sfichim were to remain, completely ownerless, which is normally the din of sfichei shmita, they're ownerless, they're hefker, omer cannot come from hefker. Which means, according to Rabbi Yishmael, you must plant and reap mamish private grain on the Shemitah year, l'shem omer. But since we see that Rabbi Yishmael excludes isurim of planting and reaping. When it comes to the 7th year, so it goes together. Rabbi Shmuel holds that we exclude the reaping of the Omer on every Shabbos, if it falls out on Shabbos. Because we are comparing Shabbos and the mitzvah to rest on Shabbos to the greater mitzvah of resting on the 7th year, even though they're completely different. Here you have Lama Tes Malachas, the Isur of Shemitah is much more limited, it doesn't matter. It's just like Rabbi Yishmael. Now, that's only Rabbi Yishmael. Why is that? Because even according to the way Yerushalmi holds Shitas Rabbi Yishmael, that the Omer cannot come from ownerless produce. If the Omer can be brought nechutz la'aretz, there's no problem. Bring it from someone's private, from non-hefker grain, b'chutz la'aretz. And then you, guys, Omer has to be a carbon sibur, but that's our Mishnah. You buy it with a shekalim, not a donation. That's the whole machlokes, whether a person donates it fully. You buy it with public funds, and now it belongs to the tzibur. But that's why it's l'shitasi. Rabbi Shmuel holds that ein omer ba'elam and asuriya, which means that you have to violate some of the rules of Shemitah to have kosher omer. So there is a heter of the laws of the 7th year for the mitzvah of the omer. It works. So Rabbi Shmuel is saying the same thing, that if the 16th falls on Shabbos, we're mater Shabbos for the omer. Kedat the omer. Let me just finish reading it inside. One second. Let me just Yotza cuts in Omer Shehu Mitzvah. Nakoda, yes.
I'd say the other opinion would say that you could bring it from Surya, and then in a year of Shemitah they would dafka take it from Surya because you can't take it from Hefker,
but this whole topic.
No, but also from an owned field, right? Or
no, Danny.
Or Shemitah is in Surya also. You're saying.
Yeah. I'll tell you. 1 second. There's two. Don't mix. You just mixed up two things over here. Even if you were to get it from Eretz Yisrael, in order for it not to be privately owned, the solution for that is paying for it with the money of the lishka. If you pay for something, then if it's communal funds, then the product is communal product.
Yeah, but who are you buying it from?
I take that back. You're right.
The limit on Rabbi Yishmael is that you're violating Shvius, so therefore you're also allowed to violate Shabbos.
Correct. But only that's the not only is this only das Rabbi Yishmael, but not the Bavli doesn't hold that Rabbi Yishmael holds that you may not take omer from ownerless property. This whole lishitasi is a very narrow lishitasi. Okay, now that all the Gemara did was we pointed out that it is only Rabbi Yishmael that holds that the omer cannot come from Surya, and therefore what? So now the Gemara fears us. Now, man tana shoym nesvicha meshvius noitim scharim atrumas alishka. That's only Rabbi Yishmael. Why do you need a shomer? That's the point of the Gemara. Why do you need a shomer? You only need a shomer because it's ownerless. Yeah? Why don't you just buy the omer like you do in every other year? It must be because it can't come michutz la'aretz. If you don't hold like Rabbi Yishmael and you can buy the omer michutz la'aretz, then why do you need a shomer? Just buy the grain michutz la'aretz. Oh, so on that says the Gemara again. I know the Rabbi Yosef that we started today's share it's the same Rabbi Yosef, but it's on this part of the Mishnah. No, again, divrei hakali. The Mishnah is not saying that you have to take it from Eretz Yisrael. All the Mishnah is saying is that if a day or two before the omer comes, we don't have omer from chutz la'aretz. The only omer is from that field, and we are afraid that other people are going to gather it before Pesach. So then you put a shomer. Doesn't have to be that way, but if there was a shomer, then the payment for the shomer comes from the kupa of the shkalim. That loy matzu b'Surya, that's where the Mishnah says meviyim ma'isam esfichim sheberetz Yisrael. Nekuda. End. Next to line are loaded. Okay. Asks the Gemara. Hohein oimer mahu sheyizra batchila. When you're speaking, when you have a Shemitah year. And I know Shemitah does not only not allow you to harvest as a owner, you can harvest as a yachid, but it definitely does not allow you to plant. What happens if people anticipate that if we will not plant, there won't be enough for the omer? Does the obligation of bringing the omer permit planting when needed? So there isn't besurya, and there's no sfichem. Now, normally you can't just jump. No, guys, here it's a stretch. We're asking to get a heter to plant way before the mitzvah is being done, just to guarantee that there will be what's needed for the mitzvah of the Omer. That was the kasha. So Rab Chia bar Ada, Boyi kumei Rav Mana. Boyi means not he asked, but he wanted to answer. He says, of course you can't do that. Why of course you can't do that? Because loy nimtza, won't this be like the rule that we have in Menachah is that kekoimitz al shirayim she'enam ne'echalim? Guys, the Omer, like karbanos of a Yisrael, is not fully burnt on the Mizbeach. A kemitza is taken off, and then the shirayim is eaten by the kahanim. Now we will learn in the Menachas what happens if they separated the kemitza, and let's say the shirayim became tamei before they put the kemitza on the fire. The rule is you can't bring it. You can only offer the amount on the mizbeach, the kemitza on the mizbeach, if the shirayim is edible halachically. So if it became tamei or if it got lost, you ruined it. Let's say, what are we saying? That we're going to give a heter to plant it in order to bring the carbon. That heter for sure won't go for the shirayim. That would only go that since there's going to be no other barley plant in order to get to finally the kemitza. But the shirayim won't become nitar. And if the shirayim won't be nitar, then automatically you can't even bring the kemitza. So why wouldn't this already resolve your question based on the rule that if the shirayim is non-existent halachically, you cannot bring the kemitza, so you should never be allowed to plant? Because the question was max that the planting should be matter, the kemitza to be offered, but not for the shirayim to be eaten. So counters the Gemara, that's not a proof. We're not answering the boy. You're saying that's not a proof. Amarlei, no. Guys, we learned to some psachim. Nasika chamisha devarim she'ein boy betuma ve'eno chalam betuma. Karbanai simur, when they override tuma, if you remember, the overriding of the tuma is only for the offering on the mizbeach, not for the eating of the carbon. And nevertheless, certain karbanai sibur are brought betuma, even though they can be eaten. Since the omer is a carbon sibur, the fact that I know that the shirayim will not be allowed to be consumed if it was planted on the Shemitah year is not a reason to say that the kaimitz can be brought. Maybe the kaimitz could be brought. Which we're back to the boya. Do we say that if necessary, one is even allowed to plant on the Shemitah year in order to have barley? This question is unanswered. Let's move on. Now, Ketzar Huoisa means, we spoke this out in the intro, and again, we had this concept of Psachim. Something that's holy. First of all, things that are imbued with Kedushas HaGuf, B'chal, cannot be deconsecrated so quickly. But an item that's not going on the Mizbeach, which is the shkala money, yeah, you can deconsecrate it, but you have to put the Kedusha on something that's tangible. You cannot deconsecrate Hegdish money on service. So one of the items that it was used for was to pay for the guardians. So let's say you're the shomer, and they're going to pay you a half a shekel. How can you use that money? It's Hegdish money. No, they paid it for my service. It doesn't become a chulul on a service. Where did the Kedusha go on? Gavaldik. So the Gemara explains it wasn't so simple. What really happened is Noitel Mois Ben HaShulchani. The Beis HaMikdash borrowed money from a banker. The banker's money is chulin. And they paid lekoitzrin u'leshoimrin when needed. And according to the Chachamim, it had to be a paid service. So they pay them chulin money. And now the Beis HaMikdash has the oimer barley. And umevi ma'ois mitrumas halishka. Whenever the oimer is ready to be offered, right before it's ready to be offered, they would then take the amount of money needed to pay these watchmen, that money they would pay, and they would declare that the kedusha of this money should go into the oimer, into the barley, which is great. So the kedusha went into the oimer. Now this money is chulin. And they don't give this money to the shomer. The shomer got paid from the money that the temple borrowed from the banker, from the shulchani. And now they repay the banker. Asks the Gemara, is Azoy good? It can be good. And the Gemara doesn't even have to explain why it's not good. And what we should know the answer. The answer is that the amount of flour that's brought, remember, menachas is 3 sa'ah. Their system of sifting the flour and purifying the flour was so great that they ended up with only 10% of it. which is an esarin. An esarin is 1/10 of 3 sa'ah. So the money l'chayda that you're going to pay the shomer for the guarding and for the cutting should be more money. And you're deconsecrating it on, at the end, on a very small amount. So it's too much money that's being mechulal on too little flour. So answers the Gemara that Rav Acha b'shem Rabbi Ba says that indeed they didn't pay the shomer the real value. They gave them less money. Their cheshbon was how much is the value of the amount that's being offered on the Mizbeach, which is a smaller amount. That value is the max they would pay the guardians. That Rabbi Acha b'shem Rabbi Ba says, Kol mashi yitain, only that is ein dam of mishar shayna. What they end up using, which is the value of this lesser amount going on the Mizbeach, that is the value that they borrow and give the shomer. And they know they're getting paid a lesser amount of money. They're still not called a shomer chinam. They understand they're only being paid like chachamim. Basically, it shouldn't be al carbon yachid, but they get a lesser amount. And similarly, let's firize the amid tanas, a very similar din. When they built a Beis Hamikdash, Bechlal, the materials were not consecrated until it was mamash put in the temple, because when builders build, sometimes they derive benefit, like if the people that are the masons, they're using stones. What, you think they never sat down to rest on the stone? They did. The items that was going into the Beis Hamikdash needed to be consecrated, but they waited to the last second. Now, how did they pay for its services? So, for example, the Pischei Avonim, right? All of the people that are working with stones, there are many steps to it. There are those who would hew the stones out of the mountain. There were those that would lay the stones in the temple. So their money also came from a holy fund, from one of the funds in the Beis Hamikdash. But here the question is the same question. How did you pay them? Those monies are holy. It needed to become deconsecrated. So Kate said, same thing. First, they would take money, they would borrow money from a banker. And that money was paid to the chaitzvim, to those who would take the stones out of the mountain, and vila satosin, and for those who would cut the stones. But the stones remain chulin. Right before they would put these stones on the top row, means right before they affixed it in the building, and now no one is going to be even inadvertently, no one is going to be moil with them. Now, now they want to make those stones holy. So they would take the money from the Trumas Halishka, which was also used to pay to these stone workers, and they would say that the kedusha of this money will go into the stones. Then they would put it on the top row. And that money they would pay back to the bankers. And the same kasha there is v'topei skein. Guys, you know how many stones were broken or not used in the process of construction? A lot. So they have to pay for much more work. What ended up being used in the building is always less. So l'chayda should be a lesser value. So here we have the same answer. That Rabbi Yosi, Bei Rabbi Bun, in the name of Shmuel says, Enechanami, only kol masha yitain, hein domel mishar hashayin. Well, they knew that at the end, let's say from the 100 stones, we're only going to end up using 80. They only paid for 80. Because only that would justify the deconsecrating of the money of the Trumas Halishka on the stones right before it goes into the building. So the kids, whoever worked for the Beis Hamikdash, as Kavan pointed out last time around, the house always wins. Mamish, they're never put in a vulnerable position ever. And the least amount of money is paid, but people, on the other hand, we win because we have the schus of being in service of Hashem's holy home.
Rabbi, who owned the actual places where they're getting the stones from, where the places where they're getting the fields where they're getting
it belongs to your family.
Meaning we're just talking about the money for the work of the people that are doing it. But what about the actual materials? Meaning if you're getting money from the money changer and you're only giving the amount of the actual stone, what it's worth, now you have to cover the value of the stones and the work that it's done. So
these mountains belong to the Holy Land. It was not privately owned. And
it's called a quarry, a stone quarry.
Quarries, and you only have to pay for the quarrying itself. Yeah, you're right, Danny. Okay, and the same thing would be if you have to buy the stones, the same concept. They would pay the owner with borrowed money. But he would get a discount, he would get a much lesser amount of money. They would already figure out from what you're paying how much would actually make it in the building, because they were only mechalal it right before it was built into the building. Okay, let's go back to the slate. Says the Mishnah Cherad of Yuram base. More items that were used with the Shekalim. This is mamish fascinating. Para, mamish. This is big. Because we know right from the story in Kedushin, from Kibbutz Avayim, right? That story from, I think, Dama ben, what was his name? The non-Jew?
Dama ben Messina.
Dama ben Messina, Shkoyach. So the Para Aduma money comes from the Shekalim. It's Gavaldik. There's one criteria. I'll spill the beans. Building Bedek Habayis. Kalim and Karbanos. And Para Aduma is considered a carbon. Even though it's a unique carbon, the Torah calls it a chatas. Next, the Svara Mishtaleach. Also, it's not brought in the Beis Hamikdash on Yom Kippur, the he-goat, the one that was pushed off the Azazel, but it's a carbon. It was bought from the Truma. The Loshen Shol, the strip of red wool. Now, really, we have in our mitzvahs 3 different times that we need this strip of red wool. Here, according to most, the Mishnah is referring to the one that was thrown into the Para Aduma. More, a little bit more about this later. All of this, boy, mitrumas halishka. And now, what did we learn yesterday? Beautiful. That every time they removed the truma, everything else, all the other coins that remained in that chamber is already called shirayim. Remember, they would put the leather cover. And for sure, after the 3rd removal, everything in the room is called shirayim. And I want you to know that many people only brought their half a shekel after the 3rd removal. So that's called the shiure halishka. What was that used for? Now, you have the shirayim of this year, shiure halishka. Then you have moisar shiure halishka. It means even though there was a purpose for the shirayim, but then the new year we start everything again. We'll see in the Mishnah. So the next items is coming from the shirayim. Kevesh para. When they would bring the paraduma to its location on harazesim to do the procedure of preparing it, in order to make sure that no tuma is involved at all in the makings of the paraduma. And there's always a fear, even though normally we have a halacha l'moshe misinai that the tumas hatohim is not matame, maybe someone was buried underneath the area that you're walking. So they would build a ramp. Don't think the Brooklyn Bridge. It wasn't a huge bridge. It was a ramp. All you need to do is if you are walking on a platform that has 1 tefach of airspace underneath it until the ground, even if there is tuma underneath it, since there is an opening of a tefach, the tuma does not go up. Now, they would build ramps by making arches. The problem with the arches is that you have in the highest part of the arch the 1 tefach, but on the sides, there's no tefach. So they would build double arches, one on top of the other. Wherever one area touched the ground, then above it, there was another tefach opening. If you have a picture, it's good. But that was the ramp that they would build all the way from the Beis HaMikdash all the way to Har HaZeisim. It's so ironic. Har HaZeisim was a Beis HaChaim in those times already. And that's the ultimate source of Tumah. But the Torah says the Paraduma was prepared on Har HaZeisim. And they needed to take tremendous precautions to make sure that all those making the Paraduma are so far away from becoming tamei. We'll learn later details that the Kaihanim involved, the ones getting the water, the mothers gave birth to them in certain places, which was built on platforms. And they would stay there until they were 8 or 9 years old, until they got the waters. Don't ask what we did to keep Tuma away from anything connected to the Paraduma. So there was a ramp that was built, cost money. Likewise, Vikevesh, Se'ira Mishtaleach. This is almost funny. The Kohen the Ish Iti, the designated man that took the sword to the Azazel, when he went on Yom Kippur, so the Jews from Bavel, the Chutz La'aretz Nikas, they would harass him by telling him, go quicker, because they felt that only after the sword goes off the Azazel are we fully atoned. And it was hard for him to get there. He was being harassed by those Bavel Nikas. So they built a ramp, we would call that a shvil, Pasha, to keep the people away from harassing him. Who paid for that? Loshen Shebein Karnov, the strip of red wool that was placed, as we'll learn in next Masechta Yuma. Initially, it was placed on the head of the he-goat. But then when he got to the Azazel, he would divide it into 2. One part he would tie in between the horns. The other part he would place on a rock. That was the red strip that miraculously turned white after the sword was dismembered. Anything connected to the canal of water that went through the Azara and the Chayma Sa'ir. Now we're moving even outside the Beis HaMikdash. The walls of the city of Yerushalayim. Umigdalei sound, the towers in those walls. And V'chol Tzarchei Ha'ir. What is V'chol Tzarchei Ha'ir? Digging wells, repairing the streets. This is all Yerushalayim. All of this comes from this year's Shiyarei Halishka. Next, Abba Shaul argues with one detail. He says that the kevesh that was used to transport the para to the Har Hazesim, Kohanim Gedolim Oisin Mishal Atzman, they went out of their own pocket. We'll go, there's a whole discussion as to why, but let's move on right. Now,
Rabbi, shiur alishka is the machzis a shekel?
Very good. The lishka is the shkalim shekel.
That's a lot of money for all of this. There's a lot of things for this little machzis a shekel.
There's a lot of money in this fund. There was so much money that I pointed out that paraduma costed a fortune. So what happens now with there was the money there? But if there was that much money, then not all of it was used every year. So the next is moisar shiyarei halishka, because the next year the Chodesh Nisan you begin with new shkalim. So if and when there was a surplus from the Shirayim, what did Ama Oisim Bahen? So here the Mishnah says a Gavaldik Machlokes that the Rabbi Shmuel holds Loikchin Bahem Yenois Shmana Musalatos that the Beis Hamikdash would use this to buy products in order to resell it. There was a business branch of the Beis Hamikdash, and Vahaschar and the profit went to the Hegdish. Now, what did the schar go for? The Mishnah is going to say. So there were certain funds that had a surplus, and it was used for the temple to engage in commerce. These are the words of Rabbi Yishmael. However, Rabbi Kiva argues, and he says, "Ein mishtakrin b'shel hegdish." Now, there are many meanings of that. The Koren Publisher says in its first understanding, "She'ein anius v'makem ashirus v'genayu lehegdish." Others say they might lose money. But the counter to that is that the business that was done with temple funds were done in a way that all of the risk was taken on the others. The house always won. It's not from the Beis Hamikdash to get involved in business. Oh, so now we'll have to see. And likewise, says Rabbi Kiva, Afloi Mishal Aniyim. That's not negate to our sugya, but it's me'inyan le'inyan that when you have a ani fund and there's a surplus, and they invested in what turns out later to be a pyramid, you got to be careful. That money that was designated for aniyim may never be used for business. It won't accumulate profit, doesn't matter. The keren is protected. But here you can't say that it's a genai. Here the Koren Publisher says, even if you're not going to lose the money, if you invested in a business, it could be that when the ani needs the money won't be available. Just for that, you can't invest it. Weiter. Another kasha. What did we learn in the last few days? That when they went in the 3 times, they would take money into the 3 kupas. Every kupa had 3 saw, right? Aleph, Beis, Gimel. Let me ask you, what happened to the Shenayim in these boxes? What do you think? All of that money was used up? So there's the Shenayim that's left in the Lishka chamber, and then you have the Moiser of the Truma. So what do you do with that? So approach number one is Rikuya Zahav. They would buy golden sheets that was used, Sipoy Lebeis Kodesh Kachin. Rabbi Shmuel Oimer, let's go by more details. What happens, like we mentioned, you did business. Now, what do you do with the profit of the business? So that's l'shitasai. Moiser ha-peiros. Peiros means the revach that the Beis Hamikdash made when they bought the wines and they sold the wines. V'chuli. All of that, l'keitz ha-mizbeach. For the mizbeach never to be idle. So you had this fund from which karbanos, oilos were bought and offered, called as dessert of the altar. It came from the profits of their business. Moiser Truma, Rabbi Shmuel holds, again, the Moiser in the Aleph Beis Gimel boxes, they were used to buy new or to refurbish all of the clay shutters. If it would be building has to come from the Bedek Habayis fund, but this is all connected to the Shekalim. Rabbi Akiva, like it's Moiser Truma, that went l'keitz ha-mizbeach. Don't forget, according to Rabbi Kiva, there was never Moiser Peiros because you don't do business with the money of the Beis Hamikdash. Moiser Nesachim means, even though you don't do business, whenever people brought Nesachim, the amount of flour, the amount of wine that they brought was always in abundance, and it was never fully used. So the surplus did not go back to the owner. This temple property, that is what's sold and used l'klei shadas. Rab Chanina Skana Kayanim says, Moiser Nesachim Keitz HaMizbeach, Moiser Truma l'klei shadas. In other words, because they held that there was no peiros, because they go by the shita that a mishtakrim b'shel hagdish. Says the Gemara, quoting the Mishnah, Kevesh para chuli. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman in the name of Rabbi Yonasan. The Mishnah spoke about the Lishoin Shel Zahoidis. And as we mentioned, the Mishnah was focusing on the strip of red wool that went into the Para Aduma that they would shecht, and before they burnt it, they put inside of it that strip of red wool with cedar wood, with azoiv, chisep. By the way, all of that is bought from with the shkalim itself. So really, in mitzvahs, Gimel Lashoina saying there was shel sa'ir. There was the strip of red wool that was given to the ishiti, that, like we mentioned, would then divide it into half and put one half between the horns of the soir prior to it being pushed off the azazel, and the other half he left by a rock right there on top. And the amount of that lashon needed to be the weight, not the value, but the weight of a selah. Don't forget, a selah is 2 shkalim, but he needed to divide it into half. The shel mitzayra, as we will learn in Parshas Mitzayra, that needed to be the least weight, the least amount. It only needed to weigh 1 shekel. 1 shekel was 2 zuz. And b'shel para, here's the double, the greatest one, has to be b'shtei sloim, double the amount of the soida mishtaleach. If a selah is 4 zuz, which it is, so it's 8 zuz. Rab Chunya, Divras Chavran, says in the name of Rabbi Ba, the son of Zavda, in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta, no, the one that was used, the one that the Mishnah is speaking about, the strip of red wool that you needed to throw inside the fire and it needed to be heavy to land where it needed to land, that had actually 2 salaim and a half. Another version of 2 salaim and a half is wording it in the amount of zuz. 2 salaim and a half is 10 zuz. There is the Mafkin Lishna. There are others who expressed the Shita ultimately in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta, that he didn't say 2.5 selah, but he said with 10 zuz, which is exactly the same 2 selah and a half. Let's skip the parentheses. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Yehuda, in the name of Rabbi Shmuel. The Amoira, what we call it, Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel. So here it's Rabbi Yehuda b'shem Rabbi Shmuel, Talmidei Chachamim, Amalam Demesa Kihanim, the laws of Shchita and the laws of Kabbalah and the laws of Zerika. Noitlin Scharan Mitrumas Alishka. Now, wow. So let's just say that we're going to follow the many that don't have Trumas Halishka, but they have here Shiyare Halishka. Now, that makes a lot more sense. Because the truma itself, that's the klal, has to go for korbanos. Yeah, it can also go for the paraduma, so it's not your normative carbon, but it's a carbon. The soida mishtaleach is being offered. Here we're speaking about paying a service. So the shiyare halishka was used to pay their salaries. Rabbi Yitzchak Baradifa, in the name of Rav Imi, similarly says that mevakre mume kachim, you needed to inspect the kachim to make sure that they are unblemished. They were paid. Here also, they get their salaries. It says in our Gemara from the Trumas Halishka, and again, many understand that this means they get their salary from the Shiyare Halishka. Next, Rav Acha, in the name of Rav Tanchaim Barchia, in the name of Rav Simloi, Magihe Sefer Ho'azara, or Sefer Ezra. Big topic over here. What's the version? What's the girsa? Let's go with, in the Beis Hamikdash, there was a Sefer Torah that was the most accurate Sefer Torah that we had. And all of the other Sifrei Torah, whenever there was a doubt in a letter, in a version, Suadaka, with an Aleph, with a Hey, they would go to that Sefer. And that Sefer needed to constantly be refurbished, because that was like the source of all the other Sifrei Torah. So here also, that the salary of the Sefer that was Magia that, Noitlin Scharan, and here again, let's go with the version from the Trumas Halishka, meaning from the Shiyare Halishka. Weiter. Gidal Bar Ben Yamin, in the name of Rabasi. Another detail. Shnei Dayone Gizelois. In Yerushalayim, we're going to have this in the last Masechta in Ksubois, but in Yerushalayim, there were phenomenal Dayanim. At least the Yerushalmis thought that they were phenomenal Dayanim, and they had the power to be done Dinei Knossos. Let's leave that for another time. So they needed to get paid. The ones that were even able to be done Dinei Knossos, Notlin Scharan, Mitrumas Halishka. Now, it can be from the Trumas Shiyare Halishka, or from the surplus from the Shiyare Halishka. Shmuel Amar, Nashim Ha'argis Pereiches, right, in the second Beis Hamikdash, when we didn't know exactly where to place the divider between the Kodesh and the Kodesh Kachim. And therefore, we replaced the wall that was 1 amma thick with 2 curtains. Those curtains were humongous. who paid the woman that would weave the peroiches, the curtains that separated the holy from the Holy of Holies, Noitlun Scharan, from the Trumas Halishka. Now, hold on. Here's already a novelty. You know what the novelty here is? That, hold on. Is it a keli? In the Mishnah, we learned that Shirayim went for kelim. Again, we're learning that Trumas Halishka means Shirayim. But if you view the curtains as the building should come from the Bedek HaBayis, upkeep of the house. So the Gemara says that Rab Chuna says, no, indeed, that these women got their salary paid from the Bedek HaBayis fund. And as the Gemara explains that my pligi, what's the underlying machlokes? Shmuel Avad Law. We're going to go with the Girsa Kikelim. Shmuel considers the Parech as a Klei Shadas. Yeah, Klei Shadas is connected to the Lishka fund, from the Shiraya Lishka, but it comes from the Shekalim fund. And Rab Chuna, he considered the curtains like the building. Yavaldik. And therefore, you can't bring it. Not only not from the Shekalim, not from the Shiyari Shekalim, not from the Moishar Shiyar, anything that's building of the Beis HaMikdash comes from the Bedek HaBayis funds. Says the Gemara Vayter, Amar Rab Chizkiya, Tana, Rabbi Yehuda, Gad Gedois. So learns the Satana, Rabbi Yehuda Gad Gedois, that what? Hakatoides, and the Chol Karbanis Hatzibur, Boyin Mitrumas Alishka. Okay, that can we know. But now he's adding Mizbach Hazav. Now here's the Gavaldikite. We know that the Mizbach Avanim, what's called in the Torah the Mizbech HaNachoshes, that's connected to the ground. The inner golden altar is a keli, it's a movable item. Now you have the two staffs that are inserted in them. So Mizbach Hazav, and he considers it a keli. V'chol Klei Shares, Boim, he holds, again we had this in the Mishnah details, from the Moisar of the Nesachim. So when people donated nesachim, they always gave more than the amount of flour and wine needed. I know for one individual it wasn't that much, but every day they accumulated a tremendous amount which they sold, and that surplus, that money went, guys, it's about to refurbish it, or when needed, anything connected to these klei shares came from the Moisar Nesachim fund. Now, Mizbach ha'oila, that's already considered real estate. It's considered karka. And the heichel itself, and the azoros. Now, guys, the Gimel is so important. Without the Hagos Hagra, we won't chap what's happening over here. Boyim mi bedek habayis. I'm reading inside the Gimel here. By me, it's on the right side. Chutz la azaros, but all of the building that was done outside the azar of the Beis HaMikdash. You know which fund it came from? It came from Shiyarei Halishka. Wow. So now asks the Gemara, now we're skipping one line under the Gimel. So asks the Gemara, now we're going to need again to go with the Hagos. We're going to have to get another emendation over here. Tani, but we learned in a Braisa that Avnei, now I'm going to the Dalid in the Gra. Avnei Yerushalayim Mayalim Bohem. Wow. That the Avnei Yerushalayim, if anyone used it for their own private use, they're chayiv me'ilah. Now that doesn't work. Why does that not work? What did we learn, my friends? We learned that shiyarei halishka is no longer subject to me'ilah. If Rabbi Yehuda, this Tana Rabbi Yehuda is correct, that all of the buildings in Yerushalayim that were of communal property, if they were built with the Shiyarei Halishka, then how can it say in this Braisa, Avnei Yerushalayim, it says the Gra, Moyalin Bohem, V'chi Yesh Me'ila B'Shirayim. Now, if you're going to answer, we learned this yesterday, that follows Rabbi Meir, that Rav Meir says Moyalin B'Shirayim. No, that's not true. Rav Meir says that since if they will run out of the money from the three kupais, they can go back into the lishka. So Rav Meir says that the money that remains in that chamber that year is not considered shirayim. Fine. But from one year to the other, for sure, they would never bring karbanis from the shirayim. And any structure, the Avnei Yerushalayim that was built in the Holy Land, it wasn't only a one-year thing. It remained there. It's a stone. It stays there for years. And here the Braisa is saying that you're chayiv me'ilah l'chutz l'shenasei onek hayamin. So therefore we refute the statement of Rabbi Yehuda Gad Gedos. Another quote from this Tana Rabbi Yehuda. Tana we learned Rabbi Yehuda, again we're going to go with Gad Gedos, says that the Shulchan upon him, and the Menorah, and the mizbechois, both, and the paroiches. Ma'akvin es hakorbanos divrei Rabbi Meir. It's late, but we're going to speak about this. Nachamal, this is so important. There are two very different approaches. We will follow the first in the Korban Ha'eda. The question is whether one is allowed to bring a korban now before the Beis Hamikdash is built. So the emphasis is not, you cannot, now one thing is for sure, the Mizbeach has to be exactly where it belongs on Har HaBayis. Without that, there's nothing to talk about. But if the Mizbeach is in its correct place, however you come to that, Rav Meir holds you need to have everything that he mentioned also for us to be allowed to bring a korban. You have to have the shulchan, and you have to have the menorah, and you have to have both mizbachos, and you have to have the paroiches. But you have to have a building. Paroiches is separating between the holy and the holy of holies. These are the words of Rav Meir. However, the Chachamim say, "Ein lochama akev es hakorban elo." The only thing that you need to bring a korban even before the building of the third temple. Now here again, we have to go with these different verses. So we're going to go now with the Gili and Ashas. That's the base and the bottom. Elo karkoiv v'keren. Karkoiv is a certain type of decorative band that went around more or less the middle of the Mizbeach. The koronis were the horns. Every corner had a horn. The point is that as long as the outer altar was built the way it should be built with its details, then you can bring a korban. Just parenthetically, we paskin like the Shita, but we have a tradition from the Arizal, and also the Briska family, they have their own tradition, that the fact will be that no korbanos will be brought before the building of the third temple. But halachically, theoretically, it could be built. And there are many halachic consequences from that. In other words, according to the halacha, you can put up a mizbeach. You have to know how to make a mizbeach with a karkoiv and with a keren, with the koronos, and you have to know how to figure out where to put the mizbeach. But if you did that, you can bring a korban even though there's nothing else there. Now let's just finish the Gemara. Hold on. So this is the Chachamim. Now, frag the Gemara, we're gonna bring three Amoraim that don't appear to say that, and that's going to be a question on the Amoraim. That V'loichein Omar Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yossi ben Chanina Treyo and Amrin. Hold on, that a certain kalim, the Torah uses the words hein, a noichach. That kol hein dechsiv noichach. For example, the Torah says to put the menorah opposite the shulchan. The word noichach is used regarding the menorah. That's ma'akev. In other words, you can't do the avodah without the menorah because of the word noichach. However, wherever the Torah uses the word sela, sela also means in the side of, but the word sela is used by the shulchan. Eino ma'akev. L'chayre, he means that you can do the avodah without the mizbeach, without the shulchan. Next, now by the way, that will be not like Rabbi Meir, not like the Chachamim. The Chachamim hold you need nothing. Rav Meir says you need to have both. And no, even the tzela, even when the Torah wrote tzela, but that the shulchan is ma'akev. And guys, even where the Torah uses the words to place, the sum or the summoi, sima is ma'akev. And bottom line is, then that includes, look inside the top line of the Korban Ha'eda, afilu sima ma'akev, the aron, the paroiches, the mizbachos. So the question will be that these three Amoraim, but they all argue with the Chachamim. That doesn't make sense. No one holds with the Chachamim. And by the way, we said we paskin like the Chachamim. So the Gemara clarifies, Amar Rabbi Chanina, that the discussion amongst these three Amoraim was only regarding Avodah Shebefnim, which means what happens if they only have the menorah and they don't have the shulchan, or they only have the mizbeach hazahav and they don't have they don't have the menorah and the shulchan. Notice we are focusing on the three kalim that is inside the heichal. That is where we have a discussion whether one is ma'akev the other, which one is not ma'akev the other. But kan the machloikes tanoim that we quoted on the bottom of Daf Yud, the way we learned it, whether you can offer a korban on the mizbeach hachitzain or not, and that Rav Meir says you have to have the kalim, or the Chachamim say you don't have to have the kalim. That's ma'avodah shebachutz. And ma'avodah shebachutz, all of these three Amoraim will be minded to the Chachamim that regarding the korbanos that are brought on the outer altar, you need not have anything other than a proper mizbeach with the words built both with the karkoiv and with the keren. Gewaldig. Okay, we have another minute, and therefore, just in 1967, right after the conquest of the 6-Day War, the next year, Pesach, the Rebbe wrote for Yidden not to be near Yerushalayim, to make sure that they are b'derech rechoika to Yerushalayim on Erev Pesach. If not, the Rebbe felt that they're chayv to bring a korban Pesach, because the Rebbe felt that at that short period of time, Yad Yisrael Takifa, and we still were in the power. We were then at that for a very short amount of time. The Rebbe viewed us to be independent, and we should have built a mizbeach, even though we have our Mercedes that it's going to come with Mashiach, with the Beis Hamikdash. So what? But if you're obligated to do something, you have to do it. And afterwards, the Rebbe felt that we lost our independence, that Yisrael, halachically, Ein Yad Yisrael Takifa, which is why now all Shuma people can be in Yerushalayim on Erev Pesach, and we're not yet obligated to bring the Korban Pesach. Tragically, and Hashem should help, that this year, Tavshan Pei Aleph, we should finally come back to bringing the Psachim and the Zevachim al Kedim Mizbechecha. Amen.
Amen. Shkoyach.
Rabbi.
Yes.
Did Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva live during Bayis Sheni?
No.
They didn't. How much after were they? I'm only asking because
What do you mean? Rabbi Akiva saw the Churban, I thought. He saw the foxes going into the Churban, so he was by the end of the place
where he saw the location of the Beis Hamikdash.
What about Chanina's Gana Kohen? I'm only asking because, like, didn't they witness what was going on over there? I mean, what's the argument?
That's a good question.
They were there at the end of Bayesheni, I think so.
I would argue, Tzvika, that even during the times of the Beis Hamikdash, there was a machlekes. But you think there was no machlekes then?
Well, you think if his name is Skan Koyanim, he would know what's going on.
The guy who had the check, the guy who the signer.
Rabbi, can I ask you a quick question on this stuff?
Yeah.
The beginning we learned with the stones, and we're trying to figure out and the watchman, how you're able to use the funds in a way where it's exchanged. And then the rest of what the daf we learned today, they use money for this, and there was no question of how do you exchange the money to pay for the woman that's selling the curtains or whatever.
Almost very good.
What's the difference?
Almost everything we learned is that you're buying a thing. The moment you're buying a thing, like if you buy the para aduma, so then the para aduma is imbued with that kedusha, and the money goes out l'chulin. The only things that we learned, Danny, was regarding salaries and a chanami. So that's how you did it. So what they didn't say that they did a shtick with like the women that were no, self-understood because that was a very easy procedure. They would borrow money and pay the salary. Then the item itself, then they needed to deconsecrate it on something. So they would deconsecrate it on the paroiches. Question is, you're right. No, and the question is still good. Where did they deconsecrate it on the shchita? They taught shchita.
Right.
They needed to figure that out. The Gemara doesn't have to tell you how they did it. It's just for us to be aware. We wanted that was a good awareness to know that it's not so pashut to pay people from Hegdish money. Can't just do that always. If there's no thing, you got a problem.
If you work for a nonprofit, you have to work for a discount. That's basically what I understand.
Not aside for the discount. It could be sometimes the guy says, we owe you the money, we can't pay you because it's going to be Hegdish money. We're giving you the money is Hegdish money.
I think certain